have several series of podcasts on the integral stage, but sometimes there are uncontextualized conversations we just have to have. Today I'm with Damiano Ramazzotti, and we're going to freely explore the issue of how integral level individuals and meta level communities relate to business, money, power. Are we thinking clearly about these things? Are we doing it in an integrative fashion? Are we doing it at all? Where do we have misapprehensions, energetic blocks, emotional reluctances, outdated habits, etc., etc.? Hello, Mr. Ramazzotti.
Hello. Disclaimer, this is, of course, I consider myself an entrepreneur. That's my main persona. But this is more of a conversation on the struggles of attempting to succeed at such things rather than, any sort of lesson on the topic.
Well, I think that's where we all are, right? If we weren't there, then the integral community would just be a bunch of millionaires who were already changing the world in dramatic fashion.
Exactly. Which I don't know whether that means something negative or positive about the integral community, the fact that we're not there yet. So
well, that's the really interesting thing, is that from an emotional, moral, and spiritual point of view, we have this suspicion. We have a justified moral, intellectual suspicion about how the economies of the world are running. And we have this personal suspicion about the competitive game of it and taking money from other people and trying to acquire money and power. It all seems like something we're not quite sure about. Are we virtuous to not be so involved in it, or are we foolish not to be gaining control of the things that actually pattern the world?
Yeah, I think this cuts to the core of one of the many questions. Like we can look at this at many levels, and I think we'll do it in an unstructured way, and then we'll try and integrally, neatly piece it together. But I often joke that like left-wing people should not be allowed to be entrepreneurs, and I'm a inherently left-wing person, so I say that ironically. But the problem is that exactly that is that the world. I can't. Like my parents were members of the Communist Party in Italy, so it doesn't get more left-wing than that. Development workers. I was born in Angola, like the whole spiel. And I got into entrepreneurship as just a way to make a social impact project that I had in mind sustainable. And I learned with time how much of my mindset was completely self-sabotaging in the attempt of being an entrepreneur. Some of it for healthy reasons, because there are just certain things that you're not going to do. And some of this for just stupid reasons. Like we have a very bad relationship with money, with success. And so these type of notions, they're not just like abstract notions that when it comes to actually trying to make a living, you can put aside. They constantly play a part in whatever actions and decisions you make. And they do limit you greatly. If you have no moral standards, you're definitely going to be easier to get rich. That's by no means. But perhaps there is a better balance that can be found. And I've seen how that's been a problem for me, or something to deal with as we do, because we anyway need to compete with other people who are making money, who are controlling power, and we're not going to just make a revolution tomorrow, and we still need to make a living. So all these things come in together.
Yeah, the material dimension, or the seemingly material dimension of all of this, because there's a spiritual aspect to the material dimension, it goes really uninspected. Like we have these communities of discussion and interesting artistic projects, but everybody's sort of on their own, more or less privately, fending for themselves in the wilderness of the world. When I used to help administrate the Integral Life Forum, there were several things I was always complaining about, and one of them was we're never going to have a community if it's a community of philosophical discourse. That's not where community actually comes from. I used to say, unless we have something like Craigslist, where people are hooking up sexually and romantically, where they're selling each other their sofas, where they're preferentially hiring each other over other people, then you're not going to have a community that's supporting itself, because a community has to privilege itself somehow. I always had in the back of my mind that I would start something like Pascal's list. It would be like a Craigslist for integral level thinkers. It still might at some point, but I think with that dimension needs to be the foundational dimension. That's not peripheral, that's central, and the discourse has to build on that.
And there's also a thing that like we do have a clear description of what economical systems look at all levels, except the integral one. Like we have some, blockchain stuff sounds integral-ish, but that's as far as we've got, really. And they haven't really yet, transcended and included anything that came before them. And so that also means that we don't really have, like, to me, that's the very definition that the integral movement is just started, because it hasn't yet been able to build some kind of economical ideology to some extent. And what you're talking about is in essence sort of having small communities that prototype these next level mechanics. So having a sense of what those next level mechanics could be, it's another thing that can help us in this journey.
I think, looking externally, most of the world is not yet stabilized in a green economy. So we're not really sure where we would go with an integral economy. Like there's very few countries have even the sort of the minimum socialist organization to make their capitalism work in a way that's good for people.
True.
Right. And there's ways to do that. You can make some legislative shifts. So there's lots of different kinds of business models that people can use. Right. We've got this conversation of integral capitalism. We've got an integral left that's sort of pushing for some of those basic socialist upgrades to capitalism. That's all great. It hasn't really been established in most of the planet. Some of the major countries in the world are seemingly nowhere close to stabilizing that yet. And once that's stabilized, then what's next? What's a really integral economy? How do we get the numbers differently? How do we transact those flows differently? And can anybody start prototyping that now?
Yeah. And then there's the whole other issue, which is which is what I would like to cover with you today, because I think it's something that probably both you and I are thinking about at this stage, which is exactly like on the personal level, how do we, integral theory is something that is supposed to give us superpowers in many avenues of self-development. So if I want to reach enlightenment, it should improve me at that. If I want to have human relationships, it should help me do that better. So far, we haven't yet seen how integral theory and an integral approach can help me be more successful in business, in entrepreneurship in particular, because that's my specific field. And that's for me the big question, and it's really both of a spiritual question and a practical question. Like I need to make money, I need to have my company succeed, and I need to have a healthy business model. And my hunch is that here's my provocation. The provocation is that a theory of awakening that doesn't include how we live in the world, that doesn't inform how we live in the world, is inherently still dualistic. Like you can talk for like saying that form and formlessness are one is still dualistic when you're not concerned about what you're doing in the realm of form. Because you're still in like and this touches onto the evolutionary awakening or evolution enlightenment stuff, which is, it's not that once you awaken, everything is perfect, and so you do nothing and just everything works out. You understand that you are one with everything, and as one with everything, you keep chopping wood, you keep participating in this everything, and you keep creating this everything. And so both, and I think these two elements are really important. And one of the things that I don't know whether you saw the article that I sent you, that I posted a long time ago on Integral Life, but it was basically a spiel around how, to make a very direct connection between entrepreneurship and spiritual practice, identity plays a huge role. In deity mysticism, how do you break the ego down? You break the ego down by playing with different identifications. You're a devil first, then you're a god, then you're a Buddha, then you take all these different masks in an attempt to kind of unhinge your ego and then let it go, which is an implied way of saying it's not enough to witness, but sometimes wearing a new mask, putting a mask on top of your current masks allows you to remove both, right? And in the weirdest, in the weirdest, less enlightened space you could look at, you see some things like that. The world of Tony Robbins, the world of motivational speakers, the world of coaches. It's all about learning to see yourself as a successful person, learning to sort of reprogram your self-perception, which I used to always look at something inherently egoic, generally comes from the United States, is generally businessman. But I came to realize that that's, just another way of shedding an ego. It's just another way of letting go of a persona. And my theory, but this is just a complete wild theory, is that perhaps awakening, it's more likely to happen, it's not necessarily going to happen, but it's more likely to happen when your mind knows that you're going to be able to live in the world. Like, if you're in a state of emergency, you're about to die of starvation, why would your mind allow its own collapse and force you to rearrange your view of everything? No, your mind is more likely to do that when you're a little bit more relaxed, when you're in a space where you could do that. And in a sense, and I'll conclude with this, being a monk is, it's a very controlled experiment. It's separated from reality. It's like the joke where the guy tells the physicist, why aren't my chickens making eggs? And the physicist says, look, I have a solution, but it has a problem. It only works in a vacuum with spherical chickens, meaning like you need to have perfect. And so the experiments that we've done with enlightenment are generally on people who are not really concerned with where their next paycheck is coming from. And so I think now we need some new knowledge to fill in this gap, because it clearly is not as easily translating into the real world. So that's kind of where I'm at, and where I'm trying to hack also my own experience and my own progress.
Yeah, those that sort of American school of business wisdom and self-reprogramming, it makes me think of the guru system and things like that, where there's something in there that's valuable. We need to be able to tease that out and figure out what can come forward with us to higher levels and which parts are unnecessarily and problematic that we can leave behind. It seems like absolutely we have to take seriously the material conditions of everybody, because if you're starving or being shot at or in a constant state of anxiety about your material survival, that really limits your capacity to grow up, clean up, show up, evolve, do all those things. That's got to be stabilized. And that has at least three parts, right? It's got a social part where we have to push for the right kind of politics in our societies that stabilize and depressurize life for more and more people. We've got to set up organizations, businesses, things like that, which also do that. And also individually, we've got to figure out how we relate to it in a way that creates flow. Because I agree, the relationship of the form and the formless is dualistic unless the form is the form of flowing at our different levels of capacity. And that's generally how I tend to do a lot of thinking about chakra psychology, which is half real and half metaphorical. And one of the areas in which we have to flow is the solar plexus. Sometimes I call this the solar plexus doctrine, which is, what is the work I have to do in the part of me that gives individual power and allows me to brand and reorganize the world, that part of me. How do I not just open it and embrace it? How do I make it strong? How do I make more energy flow through me in that area into the world? How do I grow there?
We tend to inherently see that, third chakra willfulness as an egoic tendency, but it can also be a profoundly spontaneous, strong self-expression, and they're very antithetical. But in general, what's his name? Steve Jobs used to say, I want to leave a dent in the universe. I mean, that's third chakra to the core. That's willfulness expressing itself. And
that's the psychology that the community needs to have, right? It's not enough to go, well, if we get to 1% of the population or 10% of the population, there'll be this magical tipping point. It only works if the community that's getting there has the will and the capacity to change the patterns of the substantial world that's around us.
Yeah, I think that this is like, I have a friend who's, had been struggling with her business, much like I have been struggling in my business for the past year and a half. It's been monstrously tough, and it sadly not COVID related. It was all my financial troubles were pre-existent to COVID, and when I wrote her, I tried to, like, that kind of gave me I sensed that she was struggling, and it gave me an occasion to sort of self-reflect on what advices I would give from her of the few things that I've learned till now. And once I wrote them down, I realized that they were very neatly positionable in the 7 chakra system to some extent. So whether we intend it metaphorically, or my theories about lines and levels being the same thing, or being highly correlated, I think that is a useful framework to some extent to navigate. And I've seen in myself, and that's part of my struggle, is that I've seen the validity of working at each of these levels, and we can go through each of them. And I haven't quite, I'm always hoping for the one hack, the one, I think we're all sort of implicitly in our spiritual process hoping to find the one thing that solves everything. And so I don't know whether my inability to find a specific one is because they're all equally important, or because there's some one thing that I'm missing. My hope is actually, through these conversations with, I have great esteem of you, and I'm hoping that you're probably gonna either help me reach enlightenment or help me become a billionaire, or we're gonna help each other in this endeavor. But yeah, these different levels definitely help. To mention just a couple, so that would give us some ideas. Like, one of the first thing that I realized is that you want to go from top to bottom or bottom to top. What do you prefer, chakra wise?
Well, let's come down from the top. That'll be fun.
Yeah, let's go down from the top. So I don't know whether we'll call it 6th or 7th, but I think that beyond rationality, there is not just, so 7 and 8, let's put it this way. So on one hand, I think one of my great, I did the Vipassana course many years ago, so I have this capacity for witnessing, and I see that that's very helpful if you want to be an entrepreneur, because you go through so much shit. But the part that I'm most interested in is sort of a higher level, which is where witnessing and rationality merge together. Now, I think that the discovery of the business idea that I started working many years ago was the moment when I discovered intuition. I understood how intuition works. And the interesting thing about intuition is that it's both an incredibly powerful machine, but at the same time, a huge self-sabotaging force when you don't listen to it. And so, basically in going down, we're looking at all the reasons why a person can fail or be stuck in their own business or their own. And one of the reasons that I've seen in myself was my relentless capacity to not listen to my own intuition, which generally in my case comes as laziness or tiredness. My motto is, laziness is wisdom disguised as guilt. And so that is already one interesting idea, is a lot of our own inability to succeed is often not tied to our incapacity, not tied to, it's just tied to the fact that we're thinking very conventionally, and we're not really allowing ourselves to align ourselves with what is it that we should actually be working on? What is it, some completely, unacceptable idea that I have about reality that once accepted gives me a lot of space to create and innovate. And I think that this higher level thinking is sort of like an emergent shadow that can appear. Many kids, I love when parents send to me kids that are not studying in university. I can solve that in like one call, because I've been through that. And it's just, dude, what is your laziness telling you? What is your intuition telling you? And once they start to get into touch with that, you see a very quick realignment. And often the reason why that doesn't happen is due to lower level blockages. But basically here, the key is one of the reasons why we may not succeed is because we're not really listening to our highest calling and to our deepest intuition as to what we should be doing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I agree with that from a couple of angles. I think, recognizing the voice of laziness and understanding that laziness is one of our inner devils, right? That we have devils, we have self-sabotage functions. And whether we think that's a built-in part of the dark side of the life force, or whether we just think it's blockages, or whether we think parts of ourself just collide with other parts and hack them, it doesn't matter. There's something like a self-sabotage process at each of these levels. And if we can pick out the voice of the saboteur, then we have a kind of witnessing relationship to them. It becomes a potentially workable situation. The other side of it is, I do a practice or encourage a practice called whim fulfillment, which has two parts, right? I say whim because you're looking for very light, small ideas that might sound even completely fanciful, an unjustified idea. And then the fulfillment part is you have to discipline yourself to do it as if that's your guru's command, because you might think, well, that's not going to work. That's impossible. I have no special reason to do it, all that kind of thing. And you go, no, if that's my whim, then if I make myself fulfill that, I go up like a half a notch in a certain capacity, the capacity to actualize my individual presence in the world, which is something my impersonal non-being requires me to be better at manifesting this being, because this is the form of the non-being.
Yeah. So that's one level. And I've seen myself stuck, and sometimes I would just sit and be like, okay, why don't I want to do this thing that I obviously should be doing? And then you realize that no, there's an actually incredibly valid reason. And this speaks to one topic that is a bit tangent but related, is people feel often that intuition means going with your gut, meaning I do something without knowing what it is. And I completely disagree with this definition of intuition. I feel that a proper intuition is the end of a process in which this gut feeling, this like the sensation has been witnessed long enough that you've allowed your brain to sort of process it in the background. You don't go at it rationally, but you just sit with it. And then what I've seen happening a lot is that it just pops up. Then that gut feeling becomes clearly rational and embedded with all the other ideas that you have in your mind.
You know what I like about that is the notion of refining it. Right? I think that's key to a lot of the things that we're discussing, because a lot of people who are ethical have problems in business with thinking about, well, who do we not want to deal with? What do we not want to support? We don't want to be in touch with the dirty things of the world. That's different than thinking about yourself as the thing that refines those things, makes the dirty things clean, because all money is dirty. You never get, right? Even physically, it's gross when you look at what's on it. So your job is to take in those energies and make them better, not to avoid them. And it's the same, like you're saying, with a gut instinct. You start with a gut instinct and you work it until it upgrades into something better that you're ready to go with.
And to me, that's a defining form of thinking at Integral, because it's a form of thinking that integrates witnessing, shadow, but demands rationality at the end. So it's a very cohesive form of thinking, and I found that anytime that I was allowing myself to really use it, I was really effective. And strangely enough, what has really helped me do it better is a technique called EMDR. I don't know if you've ever heard of it.
That's the eye movement desensitization.
Yeah. And it's a really strange technique, but in essence, that's what it does. It sort of reactivates a rapid metabolization process. And once you've done it enough times, you can sort of play with it consciously. But I think the thing that one of the things to stress around this is just like when you're not listening to that, it's easy to confuse the symptoms of intuition with the symptoms of any other pathology. Mm-hmm. And so it goes unlistened. And it goes also, it can be guilt-ridden, it can be strongly penalized, and so it is a huge force, I think, in self-sabotage. And it also, like, in honoring yourself and what you really want to do, which is already speaking to lower level things.
In the integral way of thinking, there's a lot of concern about what emerges at the leading edge. And the leading edge isn't just some single frontier for the whole cosmos. It's the leading edge of each thing, each part of ourself. And we don't value enough the things that we value, right? When we think of a thing and go, you know what, that would be awesome. I really love that. Now that's my leading edge. And I need to privilege that somehow. I need to try to make that happen, because this whole full spectrum complex intuitively feels like that would be amazing. Not just one of the things I might have to get done or could get done, but really, if that could manifest, that would be unbelievable. I love that. And I have to honor myself, and we have to each do that, so that we really privilege what we actually think would be awesome.
Which leads me to the six, to the lower level in a sense, but we'll replace them around if needed. Which is also that, when you look at the different, what I've described now, it's sort of a form of showing up, right? In the growing up, showing up, no, not showing up, the shadow work. I don't know which, so we have growing up, waking up, showing up,
cleaning up.
Which one is the shadow one?
I think it's the cleaning up.
Cleaning up. Okay. So let's call it a form of cleaning up. But I think that there is one category that is not mentioned in these four, which is reimagining, which is completely collapsed. It's like your capacity to look at something and just reimagine it, repicture it, reconfigure it in some other way, which is something that is just like, we have this whole idea of, integral is all about wholeness. It's just sort of like filling of a space. And I think that doesn't quite, complete the whole thing, because ultimately a lot of our capacity to be whole is insistent also in the capacity to live in a world that is whole and make the world whole. And in order to do that, we need to just be able to either reimagine the world or reimagine ourselves. And that's a little bit playing with what I was saying, like this sort of taking different personas and being incredibly radical in your capacity to produce new information within your mind through sheer creation. And this is I think it's a really interesting process from a meditative standpoint. I've seen that, if you do the neti type meditation, and I'm just, observing myself, I have this persona. But I don't know if you've experienced this, but this inability to emancipate yourself from some of your personas, or how much you stare at them. You have any experience of that?
Some things definitely show up more than others.
and sometimes when you have a strong witnessing experience, you can kind of see an entire self-image just dissolve almost instantly. And sometimes it doesn't even come back. And what I've noticed is that if I'm able for a small amount of time, to imagine myself as the most radically opposite character and just be that character, wear that persona on me, feel how it would be, for a moment say, I am this. Then what happens is that obviously that's yet another persona, so I can let go of it. But my capacity to witness my older persona, it's empowered. And so that older persona fades away much more easily. And I think that, our capacity to imagine ourselves, if you look at the lower right quadrant, each of our own self-images also correspond to our presence in the social hierarchy. If you think about it, like any archetype has a place in the social hierarchy. You have the king, you have the wizard, you have the thief, you have all these different characters. And somewhat they do correlate, again, to levels and hierarchy in society. And it begs the question of how much our place in a social hierarchy is not only due to our external circumstances, but our own internal capacity to wear these different robes. And in turn, our ability to wear all these robes could also help us completely disidentify, because we're able to make an object out of all these different dual identities.
We need to be able to freely take and release the roles, right? It's not maintaining the witness stance.
Yeah.
It's to be able to go in and out freely, to not get caught in the forms. And we need to be able to do that at all the levels. And I think it's interesting to think of each level as a kind of community of roles or archetypes, right? So if we're talking about the solar plexus, there's a whole set of characters that we could identify or disidentify with there, right? Even, we might think of a hypothetical capitalist business villain of some kind, right? Maybe even Donald Trump or something like that. If we can't get in touch with the energy core, with the potency of that, and maybe then we can learn to separate it from its grotesque manifestations, its problematic aspects. But if we can't make contact with it, then 100%. We're stuck somewhere. We're either stuck holding away or we're stuck in addiction. We got to be able to go in and out to get that right relationship.
I'll tell you like a funny story. It sounds like I've made up story, so I'll hope you'll just believe me. But I once was, at the peak of my spiritual entrepreneurial struggle. I was just meditating, sitting there, and at some point, I just, trying to connect to different archetypes. I just, sometimes in life you feel like squished. Like you feel like the powers that be are over your head. And I tried to get in touch with like, okay, what's the archetype that it's sitting on my shoulders? How does that look like? And what came to my mind was sort of like a fat cat CEO, like kind of like evil, rich white man, which in that state was clearly pictured as something that I am not. And then what I tried to say is like, what if I am that guy? The moment I did that, my spine like literally cracked so much that my wife that was sitting like 4 meters away, she actually heard it. So that was how strong and physical that disconnect was in my own identity and in trying to inhabit that role. So it was really a physical experience.
Yeah, absolutely. That's the basic shape of shadow work, which is where our energy to do things is stored at the moment until we get it back.
And then another one, just going through the different reasons, fifth chakra, at least one of my experiences has been, I realized that I was so afraid of my own failure that I wasn't honest with myself about the state of my product. So I wouldn't allow myself to really look at it. I wasn't being honest. And in turn, I wasn't being honest with the customers. And that created a disconnect that grew and grew and grew and grew until at some point when I saw it, it became much more clear to make these decisions. So that's another area in which if you're not really able to be honest with yourself and to be honest with, if you're afraid that by being honest, something bad will happen, that's going to completely derail. That's been probably the single most important psychological issue that affected me as an entrepreneur.
That's why the sociopath has an edge in these domains, because they're untroubled by their dishonesty. But you have to be untroubled by the honesty and dishonesty of what you're saying. Now, if you're sensitive, then that means you have to speak honestly. If you're insensitive, that means it's okay, you just lie. And when you're troubled by it, when you're not in phase with it, then you don't have the integrity and your energies can't take a stand on what you're doing.
Yeah, I think you perfectly explained it, because in a sense, in the sociopath is dishonest, but he's consciously dishonest. There's no unconscious there. The lie is purely, he's doing it with complete awareness. And I think that the fifth chakra stuff and honesty is not really about be honest versus being dishonest, but be aware of when you're wrestling with these things. You don't have to be honest all the time. I think actually we should learn sometimes to consciously conceal certain things we do or who we are. That's fine. But it needs to be we need to be honest about ourselves about when we're being dishonest. I think that's a really important.
Yeah, first of all, we need to be honest with ourselves, and then we need to be skillful and have integrity in our communication. And sometimes that means being creative, and other times it means being very raw.
and sometimes, I see people being very authentically not honest. Like when you're talking to sharks, shark to shark, they know they're bullshitting each other. They know they're not, like, so they're being honestly dishonest. You don't feel like there is an actual deception. You feel like that's the way things are done, and you feel like it's expected of both of themselves. They both see it and accept it in each other. So paradoxically, there is a certain honesty within that, concealment that's happening at that time.
I think that's one element of Donald Trump's appeal, right? He has a sense of authenticity because he's very comfortable bullshitting. And I used to watch his TV show. I used to watch when it was Celebrity Apprentice, and I called it the Solar Plexus Olympics, because here was a group of people who were individually rich and famous. They were good at branding the world with themselves, and they'd come before this guy who was supposedly an expert on the subject, and he would judge them and organize and train them to be even better. And so I would think of this guy as just a solar plexus with legs, right? He doesn't have insight. He doesn't have heart. He's not sexy. He's not warm. He's got no beautiful expression. None of the other chakras are functioning. It's just a solar plexus. But it shows you what the solar plexus is and can do, right? You have integrity, I think, in an integral sense, if each of the centers fits in. It becomes kind of evil if it stands out on its own. But nonetheless, when it stands out, that's when you can really inspect how that one works.
And I think there's also a problem that, people say that, integral level consciousness is more powerful. Every higher consciousness is more powerful. And I think one of the sabotages that, that one can have is also that if it is true and you're actually able to wield all this consciousness together and integrate it with your willfulness and your third chakra and solar plexus and stuff like that, combined with the technologies that we have today, with the scalability of our impact, the capacity to raise money, then the impact that you have is really profound and exponential. And that can itself become a form of sabotage. It's the fear of the consequences of what you're going to do. And most sociopaths are not really concerned with those.
Yeah, I spoke to a guy the other day, good friend of mine, and someone had asked him at New Year's whether he had any New Year's intentions for the new year. And he said, I want to be okay with winning. He knows he has a problem with that. So we're not sure we really want to succeed at the things we want. And so part of that is clarity. We have to put some of those wants aside and figure out which ones we really think are amazing. But then we have to challenge ourselves to see if we're really open to what that would mean.
Which takes us to fourth level stuff, because I take fourth as, care, love, whether that's care for others and care for yourself, right? And guilt and all the matters associated to that. And I think that's another thing, is like if you're prone to a sense of responsibility, guilt may be an emotion that you're afflicted by as well. And what I've realized, mainly through my experience with ayahuasca, that was the insight that came about, was I come also from Italy, which is a strongly Catholic country. So you have this general wave of guilt, and which is, in essence, any sense of guilt is a sense that you ought to be punished for something. It's a sense that for some reason you deserve to suffer. When I look at you like this, what I'm telling you is, I'm only willing to tolerate you if you feel a little guilty and a little bad. So if you're, whipping yourself, and so having these types of sensations and emotions, it's gonna sabotage your success, because you're gonna think, I ought to suffer, I ought to fail, I should not succeed. And these are completely irrational ideas, because the world doesn't have anything to gain from your failure anyways. You suffering doesn't amend for your sins anyways. There are other better ways to amend for your sins than just being unhappy. And that's another major thing that once I understood it, it gave me a lot more energy and a lot more space. It was just like, I started thinking, where is it that I feel a duty to suffer? Where is it that I feel a duty to fail? And I've noticed that I had a lot of these ideas, and when questioned, things would get a little bit easier.
There's a fine line in there, right? Because remorse can be very good for us, and certain kinds of yoga and exercise that are like suffering can generate energy, but that's a little different than guilt, than feeling that that you not only should suffer, that there's a should in there, but that the suffering is the goal. The suffering isn't the goal. Where suffering is useful, it's because it's transformative and something else is the goal.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. It's like suffering, as you know, walking up a mountain, you love the suffering of it. It's even fun. It's engaging. Working out, it's a good suffering because it gives you agency to be stronger. But suffering I always say, like, you know, you cannot avoid suffering, but you're under no obligation to have more than you need.
It has to be voluntary in order to work, right?
Correct,
it's like
correct.
They do this exposure therapy. Right? And if I'm afraid of elevators, it doesn't really work if you shove me in an elevator. I just freak out and get traumatized. But if I decide to go a little closer and touch it and explore, right? Yeah. So when I say to myself, okay, I'm going to accept some blame for this. I'm going to go through some misery about that thing I didn't do properly. And I'm adding the element of voluntary to the element of suffering. I'm creating a useful transformative remorse. But if it's just an obligation, or if someone forces it on me, or if it's just an automatic response, then it doesn't do anything for me except maintain me in whatever layer of reality I'm currently stuck in.
Yeah, and I think that, like, one of the things that seemed like I feel like it, you know, someone listening to this conversation would implicitly feel is like, shit, anybody who's successful doesn't have any of these problems, like doesn't have guilt, doesn't have a problem lying, doesn't have a problem with the consequences of what they do. And what we're seeing right now is that we have an economic system that highly rewards integrated pathology. So pathology that has all its bottom layers very, very strong and kept, that hasn't developed these above ones, and then it becomes therefore pathological. And I think the big question becomes, how can you be stronger than that? And how do you really integrate all of these things? And how do you know, I love mapping all these things, and yet I haven't figured it out. So how do we better identify these items?
Yeah, part of this problem is, like you say, that we have an economic system that favors people who have pathological versions of this capacity, and they're blocked on the higher centers. So we do have to change the incentive structure and the dynamics of our economies, absolutely. But we also have to fill up that space of success with people who are more integrated. They need to have more share of the control of how the world gets patterned. And in a way, that's what money or social credits indicate. It's how much of the share of how the world gets restructured belongs to you and people like you. So that's what we need to work on. And is there, right? There's things in terms of how we relate, how we organize businesses, the things we try to do, the attitudes that are shared in the community. And then there's individual things like facing these shadows, trying to open, you know, it's hard for me to set lofty goals if I don't know how much effort I'm willing to put into it. So, but what I can do is always try to grow on each of my capacities. So that's my compromise solution. I don't want to do nothing. I don't want to do something that burns me out or makes me do things I don't want to do. But so if in the middle, okay, but I don't want to stay stuck in the middle. So if I'm always growing in that middle area, then I feel like maybe I'm doing the right thing and I can at least not freak out. And it's worked pretty well. Not too long ago, I had no contact with money or society at all, hardly. I was pretty much a wandering hermit monk. Right. And then I slowly started to change my attitude about that. I started to, take more money for teaching things. And then I started to branch out and try other kinds of business opportunities, try managing things, try starting a business. And at each year in that process, I've noticed now, more money has been flowing in and out of me at each of those levels. I've had a little stronger feeling in the center of my body at each of those years. So if I feel like if I can just keep that going, I don't even have to know where it's going. As long as it keeps getting better and stronger, then I trust it. And I'm neither giving it up nor becoming an addicted zealot about pursuing that dimension of myself.
I think this leads us to the third level in a sense, because one of the things that has been researched is also how differently poor people and rich people think about money, right? Like there is a certain clinginess to money that poor people have that creates very weird dynamics. Whereas when you come from a wealthy background, you treat money differently. Money is an object, is something that you spend more freely, that you invest more freely. And that, I think it's perhaps also a natural expression of becoming more and more congruent with that state. So this leads us back to that element of willfully expressing your own right to inhabit that level of wealth. The problem that I personally have is that it's hard to imagine today being wealthy while everyone else is as wealthy as you are. There's always this sort of imbalance, and it's hard to negotiate with that aspect. But what you mentioned, I think, is the most important thing is, and we touch again on spirituality, is, Buddhism says that the cause of suffering is clinging. In a sense, you said, the more I become comfortable with money, the more money flows in and out. The less, paradoxically, I end up clinging on it, and the more it flows, which is sort of implicitly pointing at a connection between a spiritual state of wanting and a capacity in the world of getting. That we're getting into law of attraction realms, but more like, transurfing, right?
Yep.
In reality, transurfing, the whole assumption is that the process of dropping importance on a goal makes you closer to accomplishing it, because you're not thinking as someone that doesn't have the thing that it wants.
Yeah.
The moment you want less something, you're also paradoxically closer to the identification, and so your thoughts are more congruent with your goal altogether. And that's a key challenge.
Yeah, the transurfing model is interesting. I think it's more sophisticated than The Secret and some of those simplistic versions, in particular because it emphasizes this balance point.
Sure.
You have to be, not too much leaning toward it and not too much pulling away from it. You have to have a kind of neutral smoothness with your intention. And I think that's something about the secret of flow at each of the levels, and about how the formless shows up in form. It should show up as a dynamic balance point. There's an interesting thing about developmental levels too in all of this, right? Like, one of the things integralists might want to think about is, what is wealth and flow and patterning the world at different developmental levels? Because there's an interesting thing about amber and orange, right? That the traditional thinking about money was metal objects, coins, my hut, the gold standard, where this sort of like, I get a thing and we hold this thing. As long as we have it, we have some wealth. If we lose it, we have nothing. But the modernist revolution is about abstract financial flows, right? You take it off the gold standard and you just move it around, because the profit comes from skimming the flows, not from having the object. And so at each of the levels, in a way, it becomes more abstract and more flow-like. And when it's more flow-like, it's more spiritual, right? So we see people with this capacity who are the giants of the modern economy, but we need to ask ourselves, what's even further? What's more flowing? What's more abstract? What are the next levels?
Which speaks to an interesting dynamic of money, because money is really closer to the absolute. It's something very gross, like you said, but it's also the absolute. If you think about it, money it's like stem cells. Even better, it's the only entity that can convert into anything. There's literally nothing in the history of humanity that is able to morph so universally into matter. So money is an incredible vessel for infinity to manifest into the world. And I think that's why the world is so addicted to money, because consciousness loves money, because money has become this very lean vessel to create and generate, which again sort of links states with the creative potential of physical object. And we're finding more and more refined ways to create new abstract entities that participate in this process. And ultimately, money wants to flow, wants to be generated. It rewards, people who move money, they make money. People who convert money, who anything that happens with it that allows it to move, it's rewarded by the system somehow, because the system wants to create.
I think you're right to make the connection between money and like the causal domain, right? Because it is something like consciousness. It is something like language. It's something like mathematics. It's an almost non-existent abstract quantity that can be infinite in potential and adapt to any situation. So I think we do need to take it on those terms. And probably the people who are currently dominating the markets are people who are able to see into that causal domain of money to some extent. Although we also have to think that that's potentially a broken economy, that what we want to do ultimately is integrate the states. I think right, like for the ecological system of the world, right, we have to have an economy that's more focused on actual material stuff and not focused on betting fractionally against the potential failure of a market or something like that.
I would suggest that the sociopathic state of mind is inherently pathologically linked to the causal state, paradoxically, because
this is an intriguing proposal. Go on.
Because the state of form, the world evolved through good and bad, through this constant interplay, through this constant. So, of course, good and bad is relative, but there is still this concept that we have of good and bad. It just works. And it roots us into the physical and the subtle world. The causal world doesn't have good and bad. It's just is, right? So there are many ways into the causal. And one of those ways is evil. Because evil is basically saying, yeah, I see more or less what is conventionally construed as good and bad, and I allow my mind to just deny it, to just lift that judgment. And so in doing so, you're actually lifting 99% of your mental construct. So there is an incredible freedom in evil, paradoxically, because it denies everything. Evil is very adjacent to enlightenment. But the problem is that it doesn't realize that you don't need to then act that evil to stay in that state. You can use that state to play and question the world. I always say you should think evil and act good, because thinking evil means denying everything, right? And I think that a lot of our economical system is that it rewards people who have found this mental space and who've been immediately rewarded by this mental space because it's close to that space of causality, of universal creation. It denies the world. So it's dualistic in the sense that it's just linked to the causal. It denies the world, it eats the world away, but it denies good and bad. It just destroys it and it feeds me. So from the outside, you look like some evil demon that is eating at the world. From the inside, you're in heaven, because you're destroying everything else. There is just isness. So this is a very poetic.
Yeah, and it's very interesting. I think, if people are healthy and reasonably open and strong in all of their centers, then it won't look evil to the outside. But I think you're right. There is a connection there between what works in our markets and between the sociopath and the causal state. The actor Alec Baldwin, when he was younger, used to play a lot of psychopathic killers in movies. And I saw a beautiful interview where he said that an acting coach had told him to put his attention in the center of his head in order to give the impression of being a sociopath. Mm-hmm. But that center of the head holding spot is key to a lot of causal and jnana yoga meditation states and things like that as well. It's a holding at the undifferentiated edge. See? And it seems like you can imagine the perfect Buddhist Wall Street trader, right? They're not having aversion or attraction to any of the processes. It's just flowing through. And as soon as we go, oh, I don't know, should I do this? I kind of like that. I don't want to do that, right? Then we're not allowing that thing to flow through us properly. Even though it can be done in much richer and more loving and healthier ways.
And it's also an incredibly creative idea. It's like, okay, I look at this situation and I think, okay, how could I if I dropped any moral reservation, how would I work with the situation? How would I change the situation? And what you realize at that point is that there are so many hacks that come to mind when you for momentarily do away with your moral reservations. Doesn't mean that you need to use them, but there is an incredible creative potential in that perspective. And it also allows you to plug the holes on, I think that the real reason, one of the reasons why evil is eating up the world is because we're not really able to use evil within ourselves in a healthy way. We're not able to think, okay, what's the most evil thing I could do now? And then how can I prevent someone else from doing that? We're not used to thinking like this because it's scary. But on the other hand, so much of business comes from looking at little hacks in reality and exploits, essentially.
I used to make this joke that if the Dalai Lama is not giving orders to death squads, then he's leaving that role to someone who is less enlightened than the Dalai Lama, and therefore he is responsible for the bad use of death squads. Right, but like if we vacate the space of power, then we leave it to evil.
Yeah.
Right. And in order to occupy that space, we have to be able to feel into the patterns of evil without becoming evil. That's one of, right. Just like we have to be able to embrace the shadow content at each of our layers in order to establish more flow at that layer. But if we don't do that, it's kind of our fault that only sociopaths are doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, the causal state is amoral. And I think it's hard to get a strong grasp on the causal state unless you're at least able to momentarily just shut off. You need to act it, but like you close your eyes and you look at, you kind of get an intuitive sense of moral structures. I know it's very abstract, but if you do enough mushrooms, you can tap into it, and you turn off that muscle, and there is an immense spaciousness in that. There is, because good and bad is inevitably, there is some constriction into that. It's a healthy constriction, but we're addicted to that constriction, and it's I think we live in the dictatorship of the causal. To me, like if you think about, like, the rich and wealthy have always had this sort of like spiritual, like the king was endowed by God, the pharaoh was almost a god. Like I really believe that
terminology, right? They were the absolute monarch.
Yeah, that's a good one. Like my theory about the evolution of is that it's in essence, history of consciousness is the conflict between the three states, and different civilizations actually, I believe, even physiologically inhabit more or less the combination of the three states. Like if you talk to a Chinese person who hasn't lived in America, they look at you differently. They have a different way of going about themselves. If you talk to an African person, they have a different way of going about themselves. They have a different texture. An Italian, for sure, very different texture. And I think that the three states, the different emphasis on the three states could be one of the different ways that you could go about categorizing this, both between cultures, but also within the hierarchies between cultures, in a sense.
It would be a beautiful thing to see a world map with the countries colored according to state dominance.
Yeah. and I do believe, because I think, if you look at how the fundamental laws of physics have been done, is that they've been done by merging different laws into different forces into increasingly. And I think that that's something that integral theory has found a very elegant model. But honestly, I think that it all builds on top of itself. So the different states, so you have 0 and 1, masculine and feminine, which gives rise to 3 states, the cause of the subtle and physical. And then the interplay of these 3 states, the different levels often distinguish themselves as giving primacy to one or different states or recombining them. So I think that also speaks to finding a more fundamental law, integral theory, where we're able to say, no, there's just one thing, and then this one thing emerges into these different things or immediately expresses itself into these things.
If it turns out to be possible to very coherently super pack all the parts of the model together so that they give rise to each other, then it's reasonable to think there would be an initial algorithm or computation that, if started and left long enough, would generate all those forms. We'll see whether that's possible.
Well, I also believe that we could reverse engineer, like, that's another, I think we talked about it in the past. It's not related to this, but we may as well, which is integral theory provides a very neat map of how consciousness evolved, but it portrays this map as very rigid, like little blocks of the same length, but they're probably more like an exponential. And what we may see is that the distributions, the lines that separate different levels, they follow a certain pattern of acceleration. And the distribution of levels of development within a society tend to follow a certain average distribution. And so my sense is that there's probably a certain mathematical proportion to how, different levels of consciousness are stacked in different civilizations throughout different points in history that has a mathematical elegance to it. And if we were able to find a significantly enough neat pattern, I think that would very much inform us as to what's this, deeper computing rule at the bottom of it all that unleashes this beautiful, elegant, and proportionate system. To me, it's ridiculous what he's looking at.
Doing that technically, like figuring out the details. Something absolutely we should be working on to see if it's there. I think a lot of people have an intuitive sense or a symbolic sense even that there is some kind of basic move, some kind of basic procedure, or whether they're thinking of 3 or 2 or 1 or a couple of process that they could apply at every one of their levels and in all of their moments that would move the eros of the universe forward in that moment or in that part of yourself.
And again, I think that there is a geometrical, that there is some proportions, because fundamentals in nature are key. And I think that obviously when you look closely at society, it's hard to really find patterns. But when you look at these really large waves and processes, I think we could really derive some useful information. My dream is to pitch that to Roger Penrose.
A lot of people have a reluctance about that, and it's similar to the reluctance about money, because it's a reluctance to the structured world of number, which geometry and math and money are all this same kind of universe, the super architecture, the invisible architecture of things in terms of quantities. And there's a lot of stuff in people's lives, at least in my understanding of the boomer generation of spirituality, where people thought, our real values are not in the marketplace. There's a lot of things that are qualitative. They're never going to be quantitative. You can't put numbers on this. You can't put a dollar value on this. This is family. This is poetry. This is love. This is mysticism. This is nature. Absolutely. What they mean is correct. That stuff is the most valuable stuff, and it has to be safeguarded at the heart of the civilization and expanded. But the reluctance to convert it into numbers is a very suspicious thing, right? We keep it from being registered by the system by refusing to turn it into numbers. And sometimes that's beautiful and poetic, but other times it's like self-sabotage. If I don't put a number on this, then I can't negotiate with anyone else or the world to try to increase this thing that I like. And the market runs only on the things that we gave numbers to. If we put more numbers on more things, if we could get over our emotional obstacle in that regard, then the market could become a much richer and smarter organism.
Yeah, and I think that there's another resistance similar to that, which is whenever you translate anything into a number, you're getting closer to a sense that you don't have a lot of agency because you're part of an inevitable process. Which is, that in Buddhism, that's the concept of dependent origination and causality. And our ego is very much tied to maintaining some sense that we have any control and agency in all this. And the problem is that ultimately, you can numerize pretty much anything. You can, I can make a survey and measure how many people respond to a subjective question, turn that into a number, and then there you have it. And I do think, I've tried to make some like rough, I will show you afterwards, some like rough graphs of like the progression between levels and lines and stuff like that. And when you look at it, you're like, wow, these look like quantum states, like a country is a distribution of probability that turns to have a center and then it shifts at once. And it looks eerily similar to the way we see fundamental physics work. It's a much too enticing avenue to explore. And it still speaks to this point that like the Earth is moved by the shifting of these proportions, and the integral people, the bourgeois, changed society, bringing it to orange when they got economical power. And integral people are still not understanding how to work with that, perhaps. So
yeah, I think that's true. And I think most of the countries of the world are hung up at that point still, right? It's very easy for us to say, like people have been saying for 50 years now, what about the mother's work in the house? Why isn't that being registered as numbers? Why is it outside of the system, right? Or why is the air pollution from the factory not being counted as economic demerits against them, right? Which things are not being counted? And aren't we getting fucked because a whole bunch of things we value aren't being counted, and a whole bunch of problems are being ignored because they're not being counted? So I think we're all there. The global civilization is at a point where it needs to enfold those externalities into the calculation system, which is at once math and computation, but also money and exchanges.
Okay. And
actually, there's another thing I wanted to mention. It's because it keeps popping up in my head. If I say it, then I don't have to think about it. It's the notion of integral layering in terms of business models. Because right now, and for a while, the integral business model has kind of been the same as Patreon or something like that, right? We're going to get people who like us or who want these ideas, and we're going to charge them each a little bit to hear this information. Buy my book, listen to my talk, support us on Patreon. And great, they should be doing those things at the moment because of this setup. But in a way, that's trying to punish and exploit the very people that you're trying to benefit, right? Like my view of the integral community is that it's a community I should be giving money to, not charging money from. I should be charging other people and giving some of that money to the integral community, which is the old spiritual model of the monastery, where at the monastery, they make beer, they make honey, they do something that everybody wants in good times and bad times. They sell it in the town. They have some on hand if they need it. They take that money and they support the material living conditions of the evolving adepts, and they support teaching functions of that wisdom and communication between these monks and other monks. They support all of that with the lower proceeds. And that looks like a stage development model where the higher builds on the lower, as opposed to this model where we essentially tithe the higher to see if we can keep ourselves going. So these are two very different models of how higher communities support themselves and use money.
That's very interesting because it's something I haven't considered, which is in spiritual fields, the spiritual side of things is generally, at least in the modern, at these times, directly connected to the teaching. So you pay for the teaching. You pay to be in the community. You pay for the workshop. And even if you don't pay, like even if you have it free on a YouTube channel, there is still a problem there because either you get ads or you get paid in likes, and you're still being conditioned by your audience. But that said, the more firmly established you are in a business model on which that is reliable but doesn't impact your teaching, perhaps the more independent your teaching will be to some extent. But in general, the whole issue of business models and spiritual education or spiritual expression are a really complex question, because there are, cults generally, they always fall apart for economical reasons, or they are very much part of it. And so, yeah, that's a huge problem.
I definitely think it would be more ideal to stack the higher things on the lower things and create, like I was saying before, the notion of a refinery where you're taking, to some degree, dirty money, to some degree, associations with people you don't want to be associated with, right? To some degree, just the material muck of the manifest realm, or your lower reactions to things. You're taking all of that and you're converting it into something higher. And I think that's what our energy system needs to be doing. That's what our philosophical model needs to be doing, but it's also what our organizations and businesses need to be doing. Taking something lower and making it go to a higher place. Not just trying to stay in the higher as much as we possibly can and avoid the lower.
That's very interesting. And I mean, anything that looks like how reality is inherently already built sounds like it's a plausible idea. So yeah, no, I would agree with that, and definitely makes your teaching more free. I do think, yeah, we also have these like complex mechanics of like, there is a competitiveness to the market of ideas today that adds this new layer of conditioning. Like, how many likes do I get? Are people following me? And am I getting traction? And like, I think that. So that is I think is becoming a bit of a problem in the marketplace of ideas, where I think that even, take Jordan Peterson. I think he has become radicalized by his own audience, at least in the beginning phases, because I mean, he's a reasonable guy, has very interesting, he's just a conservative, brilliant philosopher who had a bunch of really controversial ideas, but you've seen how he changed a little bit in the emphasis of the things he was talking about because of the feedback that he was getting. So I think that these are increasingly new mechanics that are coming about. Sorry, I'm being evicted from the place I was before. Could you pass me earphones? And no, I think the idea of stacking, it's very interesting. I don't know how the Buddhists were making money, but it definitely plays in your favor where your religion uses alcohol in your religious ceremonies.
Yeah, it worked better in Europe.
Yeah, that was like, I mean, I'm more lenient for the Eastern religions, but I would have to say that wine in church makes for one of the biggest wins of Christianity.
Jordan Peterson is interesting because he's a person trying to engage in higher discourse, and he has whatever you think about his temperament and his leanings, he has a kind of developmentalist agenda about things.
Who? Sorry.
Jordan Peterson.
Jordan Peterson.
Right? He thinks about psychological health. He thinks about individual change. He thinks about evolution. He thinks about, integrating your subconscious archetypes and trying to become more of a whole human being. And I think you're right, to some degree, he's been radicalized by his own audience, who reinforced certain tendencies in him rather than other tendencies in him. But his movement from obscurity to the most popular intellectual on the planet Earth, it involved enormous polarization of the audience. Right? So that it seems with Donald Trump, if you want a lot of people to really love and support you in the current marketplace, you have to risk having a lot of people really dislike you. And that's hard for integrators who want to balance and adapt and be likable on all the scales. So, right, that feeling that we are subconsciously, because we don't inspect it, unwilling to take that negative hit from people, right? I don't want to be disliked. I don't want to have people tell me I don't get their perspective.
I 100% agree.
Be back.
I think, there is I think you nailed it. There is a general, I see it in me, but probably many other, this whole attempt to incorporate perspective. Part of the unconscious part of it can also be seen as, I want everyone to like me. I want to agree with everyone. And ultimately, some of the people that have the most success are really the people that don't give a crap, who are able to make bold statements, who don't care if they make mistakes, and who don't care. So and the paradox is that there is a creative potential in their slight carelessness and in the discourse they generate. And I think that, yeah, that's why integralists have been a little bit struggling to find their actual persona, because, you know, in the post feed, when you come up and say, well, but I get his perspective and that perspective, that doesn't generate more discourse. That just stops the conversation. It's boring, you know. So I definitely agree. And I think that in entrepreneurship as well, you need to be really bold and persuaded about what you're doing. That's what marketing is. I've always hated marketing because I've always predicted the criticism that would come, and I would always think, yeah, but I would give some merit to it. Marketing is about not giving a shit to some extent and really making bold statements. And so that's yet another thing we're sabotaging ourselves with.
Yeah, I mean, there's so many things that at face value, they seem like the opposite of moral, spiritual, and developmental values, the things that are used in the world, right? We want win-win solutions.
Yeah.
But making money in the marketplace is a win-lose proposition, at least in the short term. We want to transcend our ego, but marketing requires me to be at least pretend to be super confident in my statements, right? There's all these elements that sound like they're the opposite of the values we're working on. So we have to be willing to experience the feelings and sensations that go with those things we think are negative, just so that we can process them and get into the right relationship. But also there's ways to do that you personally won't hate, that you think do meet your values. It's a creative challenge each time. You're like, yeah, of course, I don't want to sound like some, you know, fucking 1950s American advertisement for a corporate product that's just tricking people into poison or something. Of course not. But is there a way for me to do some of that same thing in the manner of something I actually respect and can get behind and think is cool?
Yeah.
Right. And that's a creative challenge. It takes extra time to figure out how to do that.